Hi everyone, I am so excited to share this home with you because it is one of the most beautifully preserved homes I have ever seen. It is hard to find a home with more original details. It is literally like stepping back in time, and today we will learn about the family who lived here for 90 years, pioneers of the westward expansion of America. This home is located in Green River, Wyoming. Built in 1905 in the shadow of Castle Rock, it has over 2,200 square feet and 5 bedrooms. The welcoming cottage-style exterior leads to an interior that is full of character, with connections to the past in every room. From the intricate wallpaper, to the light fixtures, to the heating stoves, even the bathroom and kitchen have been incredibly preserved for decades, reminding me of my own grandmother's apartment as it was in the 1980s, but hearkening back to an earlier time. The story of this land begins with the Native American tribes who called the area now known as Wyoming home for hundreds of years before European arrival. They were nomadic tribes, collectively known as the Plains Indians, including the Cheyenne, Crow, Nez Perces, Sioux, and Shoshone. They were hunters, warriors, and artists. They were sustained by the bison, which roamed this land by the millions, providing food, tools, and clothing. European fur trappers arrived in 1819, beginning a bitter battle between Europeans and the Plains Indians, the outcome of which forever changed the history of the world. The story of this home begins with John William Chrisman, who was born March 29, 1854 in Muscatine, Iowa. John and his family moved to Wyoming in 1868, the same year that the Union Pacific Railroad was laid across the Wyoming Territory. What was life like in Green River when young John and his family arrived? In 1931, a college student named Margaret wrote a manuscript on the history of the nearby ill-fated town of Bryan, Wyoming, including an interview with an elderly John Chrisman. She explained, "Away back in '68, one of the so-called roaring towns, Bryan, was in the height of its glory, as it was signaled out as a terminal for the Union Pacific Railroad. At that time, Bryan was a lively place. Most of the houses ran towards Black's Fork from the railroad in one long street. The lower part of the houses were made of logs and planks, and the upper part of canvas. This town was estimated at one time to have a population of over 5,000, with teams coming and going every minute. Indians hovering around, gamblers, mountain men, railroad men, dance halls, and everything, one continual fury of dissipation. No difference being made between the day and night, except probably the nights were more lively than the days. Clearly, life in an Old West town was full of excitement, or threat depending on your perspective." In the 1870 U.S. Census, we see John and his parents, John and Harriet, and their 6 children, living in this area of Wyoming, with John working as a teamster, which at this time meant working as a driver of animal wagons to carry goods. 16-year-old John worked as a printer, a venture that would lead him to Los Angeles, California, where he met and married Albertina Lutz in 1881. Albertina was born in Leipzig, Germany, before emigrating to Minnesota at the age of 1 and later to California. As soon as they were married, John and Albertina left for Green River, where they would make their home. This 1880 rendition of Green River shows the town as it was when John and Albertina arrived. By 1889, the plot that this home was built on was owned by the Union Pacific Railroad. County records indicate that the home was built in 1905, but it is possible that some variation of this structure existed here prior to this date, likely built by John and Albertina. John and Albertina had 2 sons, Chester, born in 1882, and James, born in 1884. John was a storekeeper, and I unexpectedly came across this incredible 1890 photograph of Green River, which was exactly what you imagine an Old West town to look like, which shows a drugstore with the name J. W. Chrisman. It is possible that John was inside his shop at the time this picture was taken. This store label explains that he sold stationery, periodicals, toys, and tobacco since 1882. John truly was one of the pioneers of Green River. In the 1900 U.S. Census, John is said to work in real estate, which may explain why this house is so well built and features so much beautiful woodwork and stained glass. This colorized photo of Green River from 1907 still shows the drugstore, though without John's name. By 1910, John and Albertina were living in this house with newlywed son James and his wife May. James and May were married September 8, 1909 in Ogden, Utah, where May's family settled after immigrating from England. James was working as a clerk at the railroad office in Green River. James and May welcomed daughter Margaret May on June 26, 1912. Here we see James, May, and baby Margaret in Ogden, Utah. May could have been pregnant here with son James Jr., who was born on November 3, 1913. This photo, likely taken around 1916, shows James in his Knights Templar uniform, along with a young Margaret and James Jr. It appears that the slope up to Castle Rock is in the background, so it was likely taken at this home. By 1920, John and Albertina and James and his young family were living in this home along with a newly married couple, the Switzers, who were living upstairs. John was retired and living off income from earlier investments, likely from his store, and James was working as a cashier for the First National Bank of Green River, while young Brian was working as a railroad clerk. Fortunately, the house is fairly large, and the layout does seem to lend itself to housing multiple families, but it certainly would be tight by today's standards. By 1930, John, William, and Albertina were still listed as the head of the house, with James and May and their now teenage children also living here. John was retired while James continued working at the bank. Margaret and James both grew up in this house. It was their chatter and footsteps that filled these rooms. They both attended Green River schools before entering the University of Wyoming. In 1931, Margaret was studying to become a teacher, while James Jr. was studying engineering. Remember the young woman Margaret who wrote the manuscript about Bryan, Wyoming? It was in fact written by Margaret Chrisman, John's granddaughter. She continued, "There are many interesting tales of this town and its lawlessness. My grandfather, called now as well as then Old Bill Chrisman, ran a store there. The Harriet L. Chrisman homestead was some 2 miles from Bryan, so of course their lives evolved with that of Bryan. My grandfather told me of one hanging which seemed both horrible and yet funny to me. An Irish fellow working for the railroad came into the dining room, and the waitress tried his patience, and he, being drunk, kicked her. He was soon escorted royally by the mob to a nearby pole and strung up." To have a written first-hand account from both John and Margaret detailing early life in the West is amazing, and brings us that much closer to the family who once called this home. On February 27th, Margaret married Harold Johnson in Ogden, Utah. Margaret and Harold settled in Ogden, where they had 3 children. In the 1940 census, we see that James and May have become heads of the household. James Jr. works with his father at the National Bank. James's nephew is also living with them, along with parents John and Albertina. After living in this home for 40 years, John suffers from a blood clot in his brain and passes away here on March 4, 1942. At about the same time, James Jr. is serving in World War II, likely in the Pacific Corridor. On January 4, 1948, just a few years after the war ended and James returns home, Albertina passes away at the age of 84. By 1950, James, May, and James Jr. are living in this house, with both men still working at the bank, James Sr. as vice president and James Jr. as a clerk. James became president of the First National Bank of Green River in 1954 and lived in this home until his death on August 14, 1961, at the age of 77. May returns to Ogden, Utah, likely to join daughter Margaret, and passes away there on September 28, 1969. James Jr. continues to live in this house for many years. It is interesting that he never married and never had any children. You can make of that what you will, but he meticulously maintained this house, keeping it much the way it was as he was growing up. He worked at the bank for 35 years before retiring, and he enjoyed exploring the prairies, bowling, fishing, playing pool, and practicing the banjo and guitar. He too passed away at this home on July 7, 1994, at the age of 80, thus concluding 90 years of Chrisman occupation. What drew me to research this house is that it feels so untouched by time, very much the way the Chrismans saw it so many years ago. This undated photo of the house shows how little has really changed over the years. It appears that Castle Rock has changed more than the house. A later photograph shows the addition of the bay window and awnings. And while it certainly needs some updates before it is occupied again, it brings us that much closer to the Chrisman family who lived here for generations. John and Albertina walked through the beautifully encased doorways. James and May sat next to the burning stoves on cold winter's nights, and young Margaret and James ran up and down the stairs. They lived here together for so many years, preparing meals and celebrating holidays, watching world events unfold from the comfort and security of these rooms for most of their lives. If only we could all be so lucky.